My name is Walker, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Katherine Arden's new book, I'd like to share just a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 96 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Biden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and writers, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we are thrilled to have Katherine Arden with us for a discussion of her new novel, The Warm Hands of Ghosts. Katherine is the New York Times best-selling author of the Winter Night Trilogy and the Small Spaces Quartet. In addition to writing, she enjoys aimless travel, growing vegetables, and running wild through the woods with her dog, Moose. Joining Katherine in conversation is Naomi Novik. Naomi is the acclaimed New York Times best-selling author of the Nebula award-winning novel Uprooted, Spinning Silver, and the 9-volume Temeraire series, as well as a founder of the Archive of Our Own. Her latest book, The Golden Enclaves, is the third of the Skull and Bones trilogy. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Katherine and Naomi to the stage.
Does it work? It does work. Hi.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, guys. Welcome. Thank you for coming on this very snowy evening. I'm so glad y'all made it and safe and sound. Definitely.
All right, so I think we're just gonna. I'm assuming that everybody's been told who we are, because hopefully we're not the people you weren't expecting.
Oh, I'm Katherine. Naomi. In case you swap us.
Yeah. All right, so I'm super excited and super happy to be here for this book. I have been waiting for you guys to read this book for several years now.
When did you read a draft? It was, at least in 2020.
Oh yes, I feel like
if not earlier, there might have been drafts.
Yes,
so
yes,
she's been here the entire process.
Yes, being like, it's great, give me the rest of it. It's great, give me the rest of it. Yeah, so it's actually one of those really sort of unusual experiences because I've gotten to see the sort of like gotten a peek at your process a little bit, and so I feel like it's a rare experience and one that I sort of want to share a little bit with them. So all right, so I'm gonna ask you a few questions about it, and obviously, so let's start at the very beginning. What was the first spark?
The first spark happened in 2018, so it would have been 5 years ago. Now, I had turned in my last book for adults, The Winter of the Witch, and I was in this sort of moment where I was looking for a new book idea. And I had really enjoyed the process of creating historical fantasy because I felt like history and fantasy could illuminate each other in a way if they were sort of combined well. And so I wanted to find another time period where I felt like history and fantasy could work well together. So I'm kind of just sort of poking around. And during this time I went to a bookstore in Boston. I think it was Boston. And I saw this book in the nonfiction section. It was called Pandora's Box, about World War I. It had a picture on the front. It was a picture of a German cavalry officer from the time period, who was holding a lance, riding a horse, but wearing a gas mask. And it was a very strange picture. It was a little bit steampunk, a little bit almost like an AI kind of vibe. It was just knight errant, but sort of techno horror. It was a very strange picture. And I saw it and I was like, this feels fantastical. And I start digging into World War I as a possible book setting. And the rabbit hole was very deep, dark rabbit hole that I went down. But I decided to do a book set during the First World War. And had vibes. I had so many vibes. I was like, oh, vibes. But as
So tell me talk a little bit about the different kinds of research. I know you visited like a lot of sites. What was the order like? Did you start doing a lot of reading first? Did you visit first?
I did a bunch of reading, and then my now husband and I went to Europe on a trip after Winter of the Witch tour. We spent a month in France and Belgium looking at battlefield sites, which very fascinating. So many sites are still very sort of untouched. You can find like barbed wire in the woods, bottles, cans, trench systems still present, craters still there. You see signs that say, danger, unexploded ordnance, and the ordnance is 100 years old, but it's still in the ground. So a very kind of raw and immediate experience being in France and Belgium, researching World War I. And then I went home and read more things. A lot of memoirs. A lot of folks wrote memoirs during the time period, and it was nice because my first series had no memoirs to reference because it was a sort of different medieval time period with no sort of primary sources. So the problem is when you have too much information, it's hard to find your own way into the material.
Right.
And so I think I might have almost over-researched in the sense that I had too much there and couldn't find a way in for me.
Right. There's this. I mean, I do feel that it's really strong for it. Right. The book is strong for it, but I did feel, as an observer, that there was like a weight of history.
Yes.
Right. That it was almost like a palpable thing that you were carrying.
I mean, it might have been the memoirs because you read people's voices, and they're often they're not writers, they're just ordinary people, very literate, telling their experiences on paper. And you hear their voices in your head, and there's so many of them, until you're like, how am I just making up a story to compare to these people's actual lives? It felt almost like a burden, right? Because you're sort of cannibalizing your knowledge of history to make up a fantasy, which feels very lightweight in a way, or it felt lightweight to me at the time. And so I think I struggled under that weight of my own expectations for that reason.
Were there, there's some images, right, that I feel like come out of the war that you glimpse in the book.
Yes.
There's one in particular that I think, the hand.
Oh yeah, the hands.
Were there other images? Sorry, you're going to all have to read that one for yourself. You'll know it when you get there. You'll know it when you get there. Were there other things like that might not have made it directly into the book, but that really sort of stuck in you, that felt like there were moments?
So I think there's like a visual vocabulary of World War I that I think people sort of have, mostly from All Quiet on the Western Front, this classic high school read. And you have this sort of gray scale world, sort of bodies, trenches, disillusionment. And I wanted to find just fresher imagery, if I could, just for my own sake as a writer. And I dug into myths, legends, and superstitions of World War I, of which there were many. But one that struck me really hard, that didn't make it fully into the book, but I think the atmosphere informed the book, was the story about what they called wild men. Wild men, according to legend, were soldiers who had deserted, had not left the area of the battlefields, but rather had stayed living sort of in bands in abandoned trenches. And they would come out at night, apparently, to rob the dead and have like wild revels in no man's land. And I think it was a cool legend, prevalent. I felt like, to me, it spoke to this yearning for escape and this yearning to shake off the rules of this very sort of grim, very strict world of armies. And I felt like the yearning for escape as a vibe informed the book. So.
And obviously, the book has this one particular location, right? Passchendaele.
Yes.
Am I saying that right?
Passchendaele.
What about this particular moment in the time of the war? What about this particular place sort of caught you? Why there?
So I had two major historical events that I knew I wanted to structure the book around. The first was this explosion, this huge ship explosion in Halifax that really happened. But then with the wartime scenes in Europe, I moved toward Passchendaele in part because the timing was right, because the ship exploded in 1917 in December, and Passchendaele ended in November of the same year. So that the timing worked for my novel, but also as I explored sort of fantasy elements for this book, I kept coming back to hellscapes, because you have a lot of fantastical hellscapes in Western literature. You have the golden city of Pandemonium in Paradise Lost. You have the city of Dis in Dante's Inferno. You have the underworld in the Odyssey, right? You have these different, very dramatic, very beautiful in some ways, hellscapes. And I felt like Passchendaele, more than other battles, felt like an earthly hellscape. It was this one battle where they fought in the fall. It was raining. It had been raining. The battlefield was very muddy. You could drown in the mud. People did. Advancing took a lot of work. Horses drowned. People drowned. It was just very, very, very awful. And so the echo of like fantasy hellscapes and then an earthly hellscape worked for the ideas I was playing with. So that's why.
So actually, I had this slated a little later, but I'm going to jump ahead because you mentioned it now, which was the Halifax choice.
Yes.
Which I find, for the moment that I first read the first draft, that was in there.
It was. It's always been there.
Right. And so for those who don't know, who haven't yet had a chance to crack open their books, so in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada,
Yes.
This enormous ship explodes in the harbor, and you can see how it's related to the war. It's filled with ordnance.
Yes.
Right. But it's interesting that you chose to start so far away from the war.
I mean, the interesting thing about this explosion is that it was because of the war. It was a munition ship bound for Europe. They managed to pack it so that it had layers of like high explosive gun cotton and gasoline in like sort of tiers, and so really a floating bomb. And it was actually the largest non-nuclear explosion ever. It was a massive explosion, leveled Halifax. But I felt like we say World War. We say World War I, World War II. But in North America, generally speaking, it doesn't feel like that because the war is far away. It was fought far away. But there was this one moment in North America where the war came home violently in this explosion. And it felt like a way to viscerally make the war seem present to a reader without being on the battlefield right away. To kind of like, not just say, oh, World War, but show a world war to North American readers especially. So, that's why.
So the next piece that I wanted to talk about, which was another amazing thing about getting to read multiple versions, was the characters. And in particular, it felt, one of the really interesting things for me is that the characters, it was sort of like you had a set of pieces and you kept taking them off the board and putting them back in slightly different positions relative to each other. And it was sort of really, I know it wasn't fun for you, but it was fun for me. This sense that they were almost like a cast in a theater where they could play different roles, right? So I want you to talk a little bit about how you build character in general, and then how you finally settled on their final positions.
So I have a pet theory that could be totally wrong. I think authors either go character first or plot first. I feel like there's authors who say, I can see a person in my mind. They're like this. I will tell a story about them. And I think some authors say, I see a story. I will build me a person to fill my story. And I think I'm the latter, essentially. I I find that I build character best when I know what's expected of them in their story, to figure out how I can sort of play with their. I feel like journey defines character, and I need the journey first before I can have a person. And in this book, I struggled to figure out the journey, and so the characters kept changing as I sort of pushed and pulled. And part of it was just me spinning my wheels too. A lot of wheel spinning happened where I was just like so frustrated, so I was just poking at it, just something, anything, like trying to make the book break loose. And I think you saw that in the character work because I'm just stabbing at it, trying to like make it work, and it took a while.
You know, and one thing in particular, so this is the tiny, I sort of warned you that there's going to be one slightly spoilery.
Okay, here we go.
So, the Falland.
Yes.
One of the really interesting things is that he made a big jump for me in this final version. He became much more scary.
Yes.
Much more malevolent.
Yes. Because the reason the book didn't work in any of the other drafts is because this one character didn't work. Just fully didn't work. And he's the villain of the novel and is the linchpin of the book. Like his presence and his sort of motivations and his actions pull the book together. And I knew that was the case, but I could not make the character work. And without him, nothing else could settle. And he himself, not working, couldn't settle either. And so when he finally reads as like more malevolent, he's actually working in the story.
Right.
Whereas before, he didn't read strongly because he wasn't right.
It did feel like you were sort of like, oh, wait a second, I spotted you, right?
A
like
little bit.
Feeling
He was
away.
a very recalcitrant character. Early drafts, I couldn't get a read on this one character, so I was defaulting towards characterization from earlier novels. Like he felt like a Maroska for a while in a weird way. He felt like other characters from The Bear and the Nightingale, my first book. He felt like my villain in my kids' books briefly. Like I was just kind of, it was like an actor who's been doing one role for so long, they can't get the physicality out. And so without like a character to chase, I was just kind of putting in things I already knew in my head, and they weren't working. So the process was landing this one very slippery individual in the novel.
And then a lot of other characters sort of move between the foreground and the background.
Yes.
In really interesting ways. But obviously Laura, you know, who I like, she's just the greatest.
She's the main character.
Right.
She's the main character.
And you know, was obviously just sort of this. She in fact felt clear almost from the very beginning.
I think she had the most marked personality from the get-go. The earliest drafts only had her as a sole protagonist. Later drafts introduced a second protagonist, her brother. And the eventual finished novel intertwines their two narratives. But the first draft didn't have a second POV at all. And I feel like she was sort of originally the strongest voice in the book. But again, with the antagonist not really working, her arc didn't work either. Nothing worked. It was terrible. But I feel like her voice and her brother's voice came out fairly sort of straightforwardly, quote unquote.
Were there any other pieces that felt that you sort of got right away that stayed the whole time?
What came right away? The introductions of both characters of Laura and then her brother Freddie stayed somewhat consistent, although the order of chapters varied. But everything else changed enormously. I think I can't actually recall exactly how many drafts were drafted, but there were many, too many. And they were very different drafts. Like they weren't sort of iterations of the same concept. They really changed in a fundamental way. And it was just me trying to land a way of telling the story that worked. And for some reason, I couldn't imagine in my head how it might work. I had to write it and see, and then it wouldn't work and I'd have to scrap it. It was very frustrating. And I'm not sure why that was. I feel like for other books, I've been able to sit and be like, oh, this could work, write it down. This book, I couldn't visualize.
do you, and obviously you're sort of saying that you don't know, do you feel like as your distance increases, you're getting more of a sense of why it was so hard?
No. I don't know why. I think it was a conceptually challenging novel. I think it was harder, I think, than my first couple of books, just from a technical level. It had two timelines, two narrators. It was sort of, again, more of a difficult concept to embody. I think it was harder, and
Sometimes it's hard.
Sometimes it's hard. One day I will have self-knowledge, but it is not today.
So, obviously there's so many themes in this book that did feel like they were consistent. And one of this is this sort of idea of the new hell.
Yes.
Right? And you talked a little bit about the hellscapes, but talk a little more about, that whole concept.
So, new hell. So one idea that informed the writing of this book was actually a quote from the book of Revelation in the Bible. When the prophet goes, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old had passed away. And I was like, sort of the question that popped in my head was, did the prophet see a new hell too? Right? Where's hell? Like, you have the other two. And I was like, wait, maybe at least people did, right? Because again, you have, in the 19th century, you have fantastical hellscapes, many of them, of different sort of colors and flavors and landscapes. But then in the 20th century, you have sort of real world hellscapes. The Battle of Passchendaele, to me, was one. But you could add Dresden, you could add Hiroshima, you could add many other places in the 20th century. And it almost felt, and added to that, a lot of authors talk about World War I in apocalyptic terms. Call it Armageddon, end of the world, the writing of the Four Horsemen. You had death, you had a giant pandemic, you had sort of everything in place. And it felt like this break with the past could feel like the end of the world to people living through it. And in the novel, one symptom of this break with the past is you have old hellscapes and this new hellscape. And so I asked myself, what does the devil from the old hell do in the new one?
And there's one really interesting sort of piece, the sense of how the systems of the war, how there's no new devil in this.
No.
In this final version,
Well,
right?
the war itself, right? There's two villains, the war and his character, so they're paired, right? But yes.
And at one point you had a new devil, sort of, and
yes.
And I
did not work.
Right.
And
I felt like
I tried everything.
Right.
At least once.
Right. But I did feel like that was just so beautifully realized, right? The sense of the new devil as the systems, right? And that, so trying to think, I'm just sort of want to babble at you about how great your book is.
I could maybe throw in a comment here about so one thing that struck me is sort of the idea of evil, or the ideal of like the devil before the 20th century was a person, an individual who understands people well, right? The whole idea is the devil knows your weaknesses, knows your sort of spiritual flaws, and exploits them, right? To lead you into sin. That's the whole notion. Whereas like, sort of in this 20th century war zone, it doesn't matter what you're like. It doesn't matter if you're brave or cowardly or a liar or a good person. It just, you might die or you might not. It doesn't, the individual doesn't matter. And this,
just bodies and trenches.
right? And so the new kind of evil is impersonal, whereas the old is very personal. And I think the book sort of asks which is worse. It's one of the foundational questions of the novel.
and you don't necessarily come out with an answer, which I thought was good, right? I feel like, I mean, yes, you do, and yet, by the end, your devil becomes truly terrifying. And
I mean, I don't know that books should come out, at least for me, I don't love it when a book at the very end says, here's what you should think, I will tell you. I would rather a book illuminate something or share something or break down something in a new way and let me decide what I think about it. That's the way I like to approach books, and with this book I didn't have answers, because big questions, and I didn't try to give any. I tried to sort of create this moment in this world and this idea as honestly as I could, and I think what people think is very much up to them.
So that perfect segue, thank you, because I wanted to, the next piece I wanted to talk about really was sort of like some of the details of construction, and in particular the creating of the war, which is, sort of talk a little bit about, because I wrote all these notes for myself, but I actually want to hear what you sort of were doing deliberately. And
so the biggest thing that struck me when thinking about the war was how strange it must have been. It was this moment where the 19th century and the 20th century collided violently, and you had this mashup of changing technologies. Like, you had artillery that could fire 50 miles, and hit Paris, but you couldn't talk to the guy in the next trench because no radios. Like, you have a box of messenger pigeons, right? You have people trying suits of armor to go against machine guns. You have cavalry charging tanks, right? It's just this very, very strange moment in history. Spear guys on horseback with gas masks, right? It's just this moment that feels surreal. And I wanted to capture, at least for me, how it must have felt surreal to the people living at the time. And I think we, on the far side of this conflict, I think maybe don't appreciate how much it would have felt like the whole world was ending for the participants, right? Because everything was, again, changing so fast. So I wanted to capture, more than anything else, the sense of instability in the world. And the book has very short chapters that alternate quickly. And also I looked for sort of a more sort of sharper, more choppy like style of writing, and it sort of captured the sense of like instability. Again, was the hope.
And one of the things that struck me was how there's these repeated moments of people being alone or having solitary moments, even though you're constantly aware. So for instance, after there's this one moment where Laura's first arriving, right, and she and her two companions end up sort of alone, and you can feel the war all over, all around, but they're also just standing alone in the field, right? And there were multiple moments like that.
I mean, I feel like it must have been so pervasive, right? You have, everyone knows somebody who's passed. Like, there's people in uniforms everywhere. People are knitting socks. Like, it's inescapable in a way that I think it's hard for us to relate to now. And I don't know. I think the pervasiveness was something I was going for a little bit as a writer. And I think the book's set towards the end of the war. I think also that people, my characters, have stopped having sort of strong emotions about the war beyond surviving, beyond doing the next task, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see them in their space with the war happening around them, but they're not emotionally engaged in whatever's happening right then because it's gone on too long.
They don't care whether they win.
Not really anymore.
Right.
I think there's a lot of just like do tomorrow and the next day at this point in the war. It's been 3 years when the book opens. Long, kind of hard times. So.
Right. And actually, I sort of felt like that was, there were so many sort of small miseries right? But the thing is that that's right, and so like there isn't the war. The situation in the war denies them like a grand enemy to fight until you're right.
Yes. I think that's true of any war. Like it's especially this one where it was so big, it was so complex. Who do you hate? At this point, it's hard to know. I think for everyone, it just feels like an exercise in endurance, and it makes it harder for the fiction writer. I think this space, because I was thinking about this, and World War II has so many wonderful books written about it and during it. And I think part of the reason is World War II is a war that moves. It's a war of emotion. You have armies changing places. You have things occurring. Whereas in World War I, it was very static. Same battlefields, same battle lines for 4 years.
And they have this massive battle to take the ridge, and
then they retreat 3 months later off the ridge, having taken it, like at the cost of many lives. Like this war is just advance. A lot of folks die. Retreat, a lot of folks die. Like it's just very, very repetitive. And I think it's hard to create narrative motion in an environment that feels static. And maybe that's my postmortem about why it was hard. I'll blame the war. Right? It wasn't me.
So then, by contrast, I do want to talk about one particular setting, which is the half hotel.
Yes.
Right.
I think it stopped being the half hotel by the final draft.
Right. Sorry. So now, so now that's fine because now it's not spoilery.
The problem with many drafts is you start thinking like, did I have that in the final draft? No, I took it out. But you remember it as being part of the book, and so you're just like, oh, I didn't say that. Oops. Or should I?
I still think of it as I still think of that scene as happening in the half hotel.
Right. I think it was also cut.
Yeah. I know, because I literally read it.
Was it there?
Yeah.
Okay, it was there.
No, the scene that I'm thinking of, I don't want to like do too spoilery, when the three of them come in.
Okay, all right, that was still there.
Yes. But it just, and there are several moments like this where there's this sort of explosion of almost pleasure, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think hedonism is the flip side to this environment. And I think I don't want to spoil either, but I think the contrast felt interesting to me as a writer. This very gray, very stark environment pushing up against a very like hedonistic, very, very human space. And I think it was more the war areas feel impersonal, feel inhuman, and I tried to contrast that with these human environments. To sort of throw them both in stronger relief, as it were.
And so one of the other pieces, right, one of the other contrasts is the absolutely delicious prose, right? It's just you read it and it just, you just sort of want to devour it like cookies. And what? I'm sorry. So actually, I'm interested in how you were constructing. You talked a little bit about looking for more choppy stuff.
Yeah.
How do you approach constructing, like, on the sentence level, on the paragraph level? Does it sort of just flow naturally?
It has to. It's funny. I don't read aloud, but it has to sound right in my head. So maybe it's like reading aloud in my head a little bit. When I was writing, I still had the voice from the Winter Night trilogy very much in my mind, which is sort of a more fairy tale, a more flowy, long sentences kind of voice, and I wanted to make it a bit sharper, a bit more jagged for this book, which is set in this more jagged, more modern world. And so I think one thing I worked on was finding very to the point, very clear sentences, and being selective where I used figurative language to like really enhance what I was doing. I read some Hemingway, who's got wonderful, very pointed prose, and I do love playing with voice and like trying to find a voice that immerses a reader in the space instead of feeling jarring. And I think, especially with books set in the past, avoiding modernisms, avoiding very modern constructions and metaphors and phrasings is important to not like lose the illusion of you being in another time. So I did a lot of like sort of reading it over and like poking at sentences until they felt right. It was a lot of like, that seems right, keep going, which is sort of hard to describe, but you can tell when the sentence is right. Like, of course you can, right? Yeah.
So I also wanted to ask you about the magic in this book, which is really interesting because it's, in a way, when it comes, it's not ambiguous.
No. It's fair.
And yet, at the end, I had this feeling like I could have convinced myself that it hadn't. Like, you almost feel like if you were the characters, you could convince yourself that it hadn't, right?
I mean, I wanted this dream-like sense, and I think one thing to keep in mind, during World War I, the various militaries would issue heroin as part of people's rations. You also could get issued rum. You also were sleep deprived. You were also very stressed. You also probably had a fever because everyone had some kind of cold or flu. And so between the alcohol, the drugs, the sickness, the stress, the everything, you probably weren't fully in your right mind anyway, I think is the takeaway. And so I think this dream-like space, this almost nightmarish space, wasn't a huge stretch historically to create. And I wanted the fantasy elements to lie more lightly on this world. I wanted the fantasy to feel built in and not just like I sort of painted this World War I backdrop to use in my fantasy plot, right? I wanted them to feel integrated. And the way they ended up feeling more integrated was a very light touch on the fantasy. I think you've read drafts that had more fantasy. They didn't quite work for me as a reader and a writer. They didn't quite land. So.
So do you? I asked the question. Do you know why it was so hard? What do you feel like you know what made it fully come together for you?
I do know that. I figured out what my villain wanted. Every character, villain or hero, has to have goals. It's just part of writing a book, right? So it's high school English 101. Like, characters need goals, and they need plausible goals. They need obstacles to keep them from their goals. And I wanted this character, this villain. I knew he was there. I didn't know what he was doing, and I could not figure it out. And without that, nothing. It was inert. Nothing else worked. But the process of figuring out what he wanted, well, it seemed simple by solution, took a long time. And without it, I didn't have a novel. But once I had it, I had this character, the rest of the book fell into place. So that was the obstacle, was the villain's endgame, and then getting that right unlocked the rest of the book.
And did you just wake up one morning and you knew? Or did you? Do you remember the moment when it sort of like?
Yeah, I was in my office. True story. I was in my office, and I occasionally see my characters like out of the corner of my eye when I'm like really into it. And I sort of saw this villain, and it just hit me in the same moment. It was late at night. I was beating my head against my desk because I was doing every night at that point. And I just was like, oh, wait, I think I have it. And then, you know, when an idea is good and it unlocks a bunch of other things, like a Tetris, you know, or whatever. It was one of those. Yeah. And I hadn't had one of those in this book at all, ever. That was my sole sort of like eureka moment for the entire process. And it was great, and I had it. And then the book was finished after that.
How long did it take you at that point?
It
felt like really fast.
It was quick, I think, because I
We're like, let me out of this thing.
In October of 22, I told Naomi I was not going to finish. I was like, I will never finish. It's not going to work. She was like, no, you will finish. She was very firm. I was like, okay, I'll finish. And I had this idea about the villain in November of that year. And I think the final draft went in early January, possibly late that year. I'm bad at dates, but it was that sort of like 3 to 4 month space that finished the book. So.
So one question, how do you feel, well, obviously, aside from the difficulties, what else about it was different than writing Winter Night?
It's different. It's a standalone, which I think has a different emphasis and rhythm. The time period was a bigger challenge. The research component was large. I think the voice was probably the biggest thing, like finding a new voice, and then everything else sort of flowed from that. But I think the great thing about books is every book is its own challenge. And you can write 10, and then on the number 11, you're like, how did I do that? How do they work? I think I know, but you don't really know, and it's new every time, which is amazing, but also terrifying, at least for me as a writer. And this book was just its own creature with its own challenges.
All right, so one last question before we go to Q&A, and that is, what's next that you would like to talk about?
Ooh, what's next? I have a new book for grown-ups. I write kids' books too, so I say grown-ups. That has no research component, which is really exciting for me as a
After trauma.
And it's getting there. It's still in the sort of like notebooky, drafty stage, but it's definitely coming along. And then while I was writing this sort of very heavy World War I fantasy book for adults, I wrote a picture book for children. I wanted more cute things in my life. So I wrote a book about a fish and a girl. It's adorable. It's out in September.
It's super cute.
It's very cute. So picture book plus new adult fantasy is my two new projects.
All right.
So we have some time for a short Q&A session. If anybody has a question, raise your hand. I have a mic and she has a mic. I see someone right here.
Hi. So knowing what you know now about World War I and all that research in your head, would you ever write another book set in World War I, or are you totally done?
I think never say never, but I'm done for the moment. I would love to do more historical fantasy. I have kind of a Age of Sail idea that I'm sort of playing with vaguely. I thought about the French Revolution, so I'd love to do some other historical fantasy, but I think I would probably move back in time again and save the 20th century for a bit, I think is my hope, yeah.
We have one in the very back there.
Hello. So this obviously sounds like it was a big research-based project for you. I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on your research process, and especially compared to the Winter Night trilogy. Like, were you spending all day in the library, lots of books, going and talking to people? Like, what did that look like?
You know, it's interesting researching for a novel in particular because you want to find answers to questions you're asking about times and places and people, but you're also hoping to stumble upon things you didn't know that can help spark ideas for your story. So I do find that researching and writing a novel can happen like in sync, where you find a fact that sparks a plot idea that leads to more questions, where you go research them and find a new fact, and it kind of goes back and forth. I try to really lean on primary sources for this book. There are many. There are lots of letters and memoirs, because I wanted to hear voices, how they talked, how they phrased their sentences, what was important to them, how they used slang. It felt like a better way to help bring a world to life than just reading like a nonfiction piece about, and then this happened then. And World War I, again, memoirs are easy to come by. There's lots of small presses that publish them. There's also lots of letters and primary sources on the internet. So I did a lot of digging up memoirs to read, and then trolling archives and other places to find collections of letters were kind of my biggest research pieces, plus going to the Western Front and doing on-the-ground research. That was a very kind of atmosphere-based sort of look. I was trying to feel what different times would have felt like.
see a hand over here.
I raised my hand before I had fully formed the question. So Naomi had sort of touched on this in terms of like what themes came into the book, things like New Hell and New Devil. And I know you kind of did this in Winter Night as well, things like freedom and choice and sort of wove those into the book. And I'm curious like where those themes are coming from. Like are they born out of a vacuum? Do they come out of a plot that you started to like form? Like how are you choosing what goes into the rest of the book?
I think with this book, I had a very hodgepodge collection of ideas. I had ideas about the apocalypse, how does the world end? How does it end for the individual versus the society? What does hell mean? Like I had these very vague questions like ping-ponging around. I had no answers. And I had no sort of story for them at the beginning, but I think this book's process was about finding ways to write my story and have my thoughts and questions sort of be built into the narrative in a way that felt natural. And at the end, the book sort of has no answers. I don't have answers, but it asks plenty of questions, and that was always the hope. And as far as how, this book was a very trial and error book. So I would try a scene or try a chapter or try a moment and just see if it worked. And sometimes it would and I'd be happy, or it wouldn't and I would have to sort of scrap it. So it was that over and over again.
I have another one in the back row here.
So you mentioned that you have a lot of drafts of this. I'm wondering how did you kind of motivate yourself as that stack kept getting higher and higher, different ideas, different pieces, different characterizations, and I'm sure it got really muddled. Like how did you kind of find your through line and keep going and get to the end?
I mean, I think it's funny. I have
A lot of us beat her up.
Naomi gave me some lectures. That was super helpful. My dad was also kind of like, "You're a professional. Finish your work." Like, that helped too. Little lecture. But I think the blessing and the curse, at least of a writer, is you do know when it's right, and it's literally just a feeling. It feels right. You also know when it's wrong, and so it can sort of torture you that way. But I knew when it was right. You just know. You just look at it and say it's right. It's a thing that's hard to describe or explain, but you just kind of feel it, just in you somewhere that it works. Yeah.
I have another one over here.
Related question on the other side. When did you show the first draft to Naomi, or whichever draft?
Which draft did you?
It was early. Like I remember
you
it was
saw
just a few
pieces,
chapters
yeah.
with Laura, and I was
No.
immediately like, "Give me more!
No,
Give me more!"
you saw pieces. I remember this. We were at a con, and I think it might have been before Winter the Witch came out, and I shoved it across the table at you, I think, at breakfast. I remember this.
Yes.
And it was just a few chapters in Halifax, and it was very different from the
Yes.
final draft, of course.
No, and I remember immediately being like, "This is amazing."
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, you hadn't fully settled on
I
it
was like,
yet, so
should
sorry.
should I do this? And you were like, yes, do it. And I was like, okay, it's your fault.
I was right. Now I know.
Elena has another question in the back there.
I'm a big fan of both of yours, and I was wondering if you could just share a little bit also about what Naomi is working on.
Oh, yes.
Well,
Yes.
she's been reading. She's
I've
been
been
reading it
reading
for me.
It's my favorite thing. And as somebody who loves everything she's written, this is still my favorite thing. So
It's called Folly, and it's a secondary world book, and it's going to be a while because I'm writing the whole thing, and then I'm figuring out how it breaks up into books afterwards, which my publisher is very excited.
only you can do that. That's incredible. But yes, it's amazing. So good. Oh.
unfortunately, this is our last question this evening.
In that case, I'll try to make it count. So one thing that I personally have always been really fascinated in terms of primary resources is the idea that memory and history both are constructions, that they're easily fallible, that there's something about them that's highly personal, and in that there's value, that as flawed as it may be, that there's something telling in that. So throughout your research process and in writing the book, laying out the themes and the characters, was that something that you were grappling with, the fact that memory and history both are written in a flawed way?
I mean, one thing that really struck me about people who have fought in this war, or any war, is that they would come home different, they would come home changed. And I think for me, one way of thinking about this change is they could remember their past, of course. They remember like their childhoods, their families, their friends, their lives, their sweethearts, but the significance is changed or lost or altered. Like you have the same collection of, and this happened and that, but how you feel about it is different, and it makes you different, right? And that's kind of the effect of a traumatic experience. And that's the war, who's kind of villain A in my novel. And then villain B also sort of has to do with memory in a different way. And I wanted to create tension between the two. And I'm trying not to spoil anything. But that was how I approach memory, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Good question.
Let's give these folks a round of applause. Thank you both for being here. We're going to get a little sign line set up. If you don't have a copy of the book yet, we have lots of copies left. We have some of Naomi's books as well. Everyone stay seated for just 1 second, but while we get this table set up, let's give these folks one more round.